For the past 23 years, C-SPAN has brought more than 60 middle and high school teachers here in Washington, D.C. for the summer to learn more about our nation's government and how the process works. Also learning how they can use the C-SPAN video library in the classroom. We welcome this year's fellows. Bill Camps is a high school history teacher from Hightstown, New Jersey, and Sunshine Cavalluzzi, who is from Placentia, California, teaches government. To both of you, welcome, and welcome to the C-SPAN Teacher Fellowship Program. Let me begin with you. How do you engage high school students in government?
It's definitely a challenge, I think, particularly because our political discourse places so much emphasis on STEM. So kids understand why that side of their learning matters, but they don't always come in with the knowledge of why the humanities is important. So like anything else, I think it's our challenge to start with relevance. Why does this matter to you? And to contextualize the science and the engineering and the math and the technology. What are we doing it for? What are our responsibilities to do it well? And that's where resources like the C-SPAN library are incredibly important, because we can see in real time how these things are playing out and why they matter. And I think my beginning sell is always something along the lines of, this might be the only government class you ever take. You're going to be a voter forever. You're going to be a juror forever. So I need to give you tools that are going to help you for the rest of your life in those pursuits, do them well. And it's helpful to do that if you know not just what's happening now, but why it's happening and what's come before. And we know with Twitter and social media, the attention span of this generation can be relatively small. So what are some of your secrets? Bill Camps.
Well, I would say too, as a history component, this is a chance for them to learn a little bit about their story. That their story doesn't begin the moment they were born. Their story actually starts with people who have come long before them, who have shaped the way that the world around them they were born into operates. And so if they start to realize that, wait a minute, this doesn't just start and end with me, but what I contribute and where I'm coming from is all part of this bigger story. And so in that way, allowing them then to take in other people's opinions, take in the perspectives of others through social media, but again, also through video, it gives them a chance to be able to really think, well, okay, this is how I see the world, but why is it that I see the world this way? And how can I maybe expand that a little bit by taking in other people's perspectives?
You get the students at the high school level, so let me follow up with you. Do you sense that the students come to high school with a basic understanding of government and the documents that shaped America?
I think some of them do. And I think, they've been taught well, but again, if you don't know why it's important, you don't always pay attention when you learn. And I think they certainly have a sense that they live in this extraordinary country, but that it's my responsibility to take that and help them understand, why is it so extraordinary? What does it mean to say that we're free? Let's explore this more. So I think some kids have a really, really fundamental understanding, and other kids have a narrow one, and so it's my job to meet them wherever they are and push them further.
What is your sense?
I would say, too, that a lot of times students are picking up just what they hear, and maybe they come in with a lot of assumptions, and I think our job is to really help them work through their assumptions, to challenge them, to ask the right questions, to push back when necessary, but also create a space that they can acknowledge and admit that it's okay if they don't know something, and that's okay, that that's a good starting place to acknowledge that maybe I have limitations, and that that's a healthy way to move forward, and to give them then the opportunities and the resources and the critical thinking skills to be able to take in, again, things like government, but even, again, some of the larger issues that are at hand in the world around them.
And I think back to your point about Twitter, when you're trying to tell a story in 140 characters, it's not a very long story. So one of the things I think about when we talk about the Declaration of Independence, they all know the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness part. But then I ask, what's the next sentence? And I argue the next sentence is really the revolution, right? That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's talking about, why does it all matter? Not just the soundbite, not just the 140 characters, not just the part that you've kind of been hearing, but what does it all mean and how does it all fit into this grand American narrative?
Yeah. Let's talk about the last year, one of the most polarizing elections, and certainly one of the most consequential elections in American history, where you saw the popular vote going to the Democrat, the Electoral College vote going to the Republican. Donald Trump is our 45th president. So how do you teach that in the classroom?
So I had a very unique experience, because 4 years ago, after the 2012 election, I pitched to my supervisors and I said, it would be great if we had a class that we could actually engage the presidential election completely. Because a lot of times in history classes especially, you have a curriculum, you have to get through certain time frames, you have to keep moving, and so we certainly take the opportunity to engage the election, but it oftentimes has to fit in around some of these other issues. and other topics. But this year, I was given the opportunity to teach in the fall semester an elective solely based on the election. And so it gave students a chance to, who really wanted to learn, students who were eligible to vote actually in November for the first time, a chance to really process through how they think, and again, where they stand on some of the issues and how they understand the history of the presidency and the history of media in the presidency. So we had a really great opportunity to just, and it was at the end of the day, so it's of course all that energy at the end of the day coming in, and there's, they engaged it well, and I really got a kind of first-hand look at being able to see how a 16, 17-year-old is taking in all of this.
And all of it in real time with no shortage of news.
No, we would, in fact, a lot of times, whatever would happen in the course of that day, I'd have to kind of scrap my plan and be like, all right, we're talking about this today because this came out. So in a way, it even challenged me as a teacher to have to say, all right, I need to be very flexible and very clued in as to what's going on around me so that I can adapt in real time to what's happening. So it was a challenge for sure, but they were excellent.
And Sunshine Capelucci, also a lesson on the Electoral College.
Absolutely. And my first semester actually teaching was in the fall of 2000. So it was really an interesting contrast between that, which was a similar situation, and this one where the emotions were so heightened on both sides. But it was great because the way the timing works in the AP class, we had talked in October and November about the Electoral College. Why do we still have it? What are the arguments against it? So to have this very, very timely example of, see, when we talk about how government's relevant, this is why this can happen, and how do we take the theory we talked about and set it in the context of this reality and what we should about it.
Some of the moments that you've helped us identify that other teachers can use, again, all of it available on our C-SPAN video library at cspan.org. The inauguration of Donald Trump from January 20th of this year from the west front of the U.S. Capitol.
What truly matters is not which party controls our government, but whether our government is controlled by the people. January 20th, 2017 will be remembered as the day the people became the rulers of this nation again. The forgotten men and women of our country will be forgotten no longer. Everyone is listening to you now. You came by the tens of millions to become part of a historic movement, the likes of which the world has never seen before. At the center of this movement is a crucial conviction that a nation exists to serve its citizens. Americans want great schools for their children, safe neighborhoods for their families, and good jobs for themselves. These are just and reasonable demands of righteous people and a righteous public. But for too many of our citizens, a different reality exists. Mothers and children trapped in poverty in our inner cities, rusted out factories scattered like tombstones across the landscape of our nation, an education system flush with cash, but which leaves our young and beautiful students deprived of all knowledge, and the crime and the gangs and the drugs that have stolen too many lives and robbed our country of so much unrealized potential. This American carnage stops right here and stops right now.
January 20th, the inauguration of Donald Trump and Bill Camps in the classroom. How did this speech play out?
Well, we certainly watched it in real time. I offered up my classroom during that time. Actually, it was at lunch, so students were not in actively class, but I made sure that students who wanted to come by watched it. I mean, there was, as students have opinions like Americans have opinions, there was mixed reactions. Some, certainly embraced some of the populist language of it. Others felt like there was maybe some exaggerations in there. But I would say, for For the most part, students were clued in. They were watching it. They were processing it. And for me, as somebody, again, who likes to kind of take things in a big picture, it was interesting that a group in my 5th period class who had to do the lead a sort of Socratic seminar to the rest of this class at the end of the school year brought back this as a subject of populism and what is the grand narrative of presidencies using populist language and how that plays out in the inaugurations as well as some of the other campaign rhetoric. And so for them, it's interesting that, again, as much as there were some differences in how they interpreted the day, they certainly were able to see it in a larger historical context, which is what we're looking for.
In the context of your courses on government, we've had polarizing times in America. Before World War II, the isolation movement in the U.S., Vietnam, the civil rights movement, Watergate, the impeachment of Bill Clinton. So how do you deal with the current political climate in context of what we've seen in the 20th century?
I think explaining to students that what's different now in some ways is the ease of communication and is the fact that news travels so fast and so broadly that it feels like everything that's happening everywhere is happening to you. And and also with the wide array of news sources that you can choose to only hear things that you agree with already. And that's what makes it different, but that these aren't new times. And that's, that America has always been stronger than the challenges that we faced. And for kids who are feeling unsettled or feeling left out or feeling frustrated, that there's no reason to be pessimistic. There's a reason, in fact, to be very optimistic that they're better at channeling the modern tools available than anyone at any time in history ever has been. And so they have the capacity to create change, and that they should view that as this really important tool, but also how critical it is that they do talk to other people, that they do expand outside their confirmation bias narrative and hear other stories, that they listen to something like the inauguration dispassionately, that they maybe listen to it twice, once for their emotion and once with reason, to say, okay, now what do I do with this information?
For both of you, does fake news come up?
Yes.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah. But to be honest, it's not a new discussion. I think most teachers would probably say that we've been talking about checking your sources and making sure you find reliable information along the way. So in some way, as funny as it sounds, it's actually, I think, helpful for us as teachers that this is now a national dialogue and that these words are thrown around, because students are now even more hyper aware of I want to make sure that I'm doing things accurately. And so in a way, it has given legitimacy to something that I think we've been saying all along, which is, look, you've got to make sure that what you say is supported by the right facts, and you can't just go in and make something up on a paper and expect to be evaluated well for that, and we're gonna hit you on that. So in some ways, it's actually nice that there's a national conversation about this, because it has allowed us to say, look, see how this is playing out around you. We're not just making this up. We're not just trying to be difficult to be difficult.
And I know as part of your July Fellowship, you've had a chance to go to the White House, hear from Jim Acosta and others in the White House briefing room. This is Jim Acosta of CNN during President Trump's first news conference. Let's watch.
But aren't you concerned, sir, that you are undermining the people's faith in the First Amendment, freedom of the press of this country, when you call stories you don't like fake news? Why not just say it's a story I don't like?
I do that.
Call it fake news.
No, I do that.
Undermining confidence in our news media.
Here's the thing. Okay, I understand what you, and you're right about that, except this. See, I know when I should get good and when I should get bad. And sometimes I'll say, wow, that's going to be a great story, and I'll get killed. I know what's good and bad. I'd be a pretty good reporter, not as good as you. But I know what's good. I know what's bad. And when they change it and make it really bad, something that should be positive, sometimes something that should be very positive, they'll make okay. They'll even make it negative. So I understand it. So because I'm there, I know what was said, I know who's saying it, I'm there. So it's very important to me. Look, I want to see an honest press. When I started off today by saying that it's so important to the public to get an honest press. The public doesn't believe you people anymore. Now, maybe I had something to do with that. I don't know. But they don't believe you. If you were straight and really told it like it is, as Howard Cosell used to say, right? Of course, he had some questions also. But if you were straight, I would be your biggest booster. I would be your biggest fan in the world, including bad stories about me. But if you go, as an example, you're CNN, I mean, it's story after story after story is bad. I won. And the other thing, chaos. There's zero chaos. We are running, this is a fine-tuned machine. And Reince happens to be doing a good job, but half of his job is putting out lies by the press. I said to him yesterday, this whole Russia scam that you guys are building so that you don't talk about the real subject, which is illegal leaks. But I watched him yesterday working so hard to try and get that story proper. And I'm saying, here's my chief of staff, a really good guy, did a phenomenal job at RNC. I mean, he won the election, right? Won the presidency. We got some senators. We got some all over the country. You take a look. He's done a great job. And I said to myself, and I said to somebody that was in there, I said, you take a look at Reince. He's working so hard just putting out fires that are fake fires. I mean, they're fake. They're not true.
That was back in February from the White House and the news conference with Donald Trump from the East Room. Sunshine Cavalluzzi, as you look at that and try to teach that to the students, what's your takeaway?
Well, one of the things that is going to end up having been such a privilege in teaching that was the opportunity to go to the White House. And I'm going to tell my students, I was there in the White House briefing room, and this extraordinary experience for me. And Jim Acosta popped in and said hi to us, and it was 8 p.m. And he was still there doing a job that he'd started really early this morning. That these aren't just sound bites. These aren't just accusations. These are real people working really, really hard to do a job, and that there's a difference between what makes headlines and what is actually the story, and that we need to, as responsible consumers of news, separate the two and say maybe it's fake or maybe it's the story, but let's separate the impulse to just label something in a way that's quick or convenient from what's actually being told. And let's understand that everybody involved in this business, from the president to the reporter and everybody in the middle, are really trying their best to tell a story, and they might disagree on what that story should look like, but that they're all working hard at this. And I always remember how Jon Stewart used to call his show fake news back in his days on The Daily Show, and that's what that term used to mean to me, is news on a comedy channel. So we'll talk about the interesting feature of that being applied to news that's on CNN, news that's on any other broadcast television show.
Yeah, I would just add, you brought up social media earlier, that this is, again, I think one of the limitations of social media is that it takes very complex issues and brings it down to 140 characters, something that just can't really cover the complexity of that these are human beings working hours and hours and hours to make sure that they feel like they're communicating something that they feel strongly about, or that they feel they have the factual support over, and whether that's people in the administration or whether that's people in the media. And I think when we forget the humanity side of that, and we forget that there is complexity to their stories and to their worldviews, we fall into these traps of just kind of black and white all the time.
And I think we'll also discuss in my class, what's our responsibility as consumers in contributing to this, that we expect our news in real time. We expect that journalist to be able to, as this is happening, be tweeting about it, or be, put up a blog post or put up a news story virtually as it's happening, and then also not make mistakes. That are we holding them to an unfair standard? And are we holding our political leaders to an unfair standard, saying, talk to us all day long, don't ever make a mistake, don't ever contradict yourself, don't ever change your mind as you get more information, because then we're going to call you a flip-flopper? Are we then holding people to a standard they can't possibly reach, and then contributing to that in our own way? Are we complicit? And so do we need to then step back and be more responsible as consumers?
Let's talk about the polarization in this country and the process in a moment that took place back in February on the Senate floor. We carried it live on C-SPAN 2 with Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts, and then this exchange with the Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell on the nomination of Jeff Sessions to be the U.S. Attorney General.
In 2013, Senator Sessions voted against reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act, a bill that expanded the protections and services provided to victims of sexual assault and domestic violence. There's a piece from the Bedford Minuteman that really tells the story of how sexual violence impacts Massachusetts. And this is what it said. They are mothers, daughters, sisters, fathers, sons, and brothers.
Mr. President.
They are...
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
The senators impugn the motives and conduct of our colleague from Alabama as warned by the chair. Senator Warren, quote, said Senator Sessions has used the awesome power of his office to chill the free exercise of the vote by black citizens. I call the senator to order under the provisions of Rule 19.
Mr. President,
The Senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, I am surprised that the words of Coretta Scott King are not suitable for debate in the United States Senate. I ask leave of the Senate to continue my remarks.
Is there objection?
Object.
I appeal the ruling.
Objection is heard. The senator will take her seat.
Mr. President, I appeal the ruling of the chair, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Warren was giving a lengthy speech. She had appeared to violate the rule. She was warned. She was given an explanation. Nevertheless, she persisted.
Part of the Senate debate, and really an incredible moment where politics and process and social media came into play.
Absolutely. So one of the things that Bill and I are responsible for doing this summer, as you mentioned, is creating content to include in C-SPAN's teacher website, C-SPAN Classroom. And this was one of the moments that I chose for one of my lessons on Senate Rule 19.2, which is something that I can assure you in 17 years my students have never been interested in until now. And that's one of the gifts of this time. You mentioned it's polarized, but we also have an awareness that I've never seen as a teacher in the intricacies of the process among the public as a whole. And of course that trickles down into our classroom to say, okay, remember how I talked about those Senate rules and you all kind of mentally snoozed because you didn't think it was important? Here we go. Let's put it in this context. You saw hashtag nevertheless she persisted. But what does that mean? Let's look beyond the hashtag and really delve into what is all this about? What are these underlying questions and intricacies?
And of course, Senator Mitch McConnell is a master of the Senate rules, Bill Camps.
Yeah, and certainly, you know, when there's a dynamic there where you've got sort of two kind of very large figures in their parties, and there's a sort of a repartee on like using the rules as well as using the media around it, you're going to have an inevitable story that comes out of this. And I think, again, that's what students grab to. And that's, again, what I like sometimes about even the hashtag, even though it's simple, it's a good place to start, and it's a good place to start a dialogue. And, you know, students who I would have never thought would watch an event taking place on Capitol Hill were coming in the next day and saying, can we talk about this? Because I want to know what happened here, and can you help me understand this? And so they're even coming in with a sort of attitude of like, I'm going to acknowledge that I don't know much. Can we dialogue through this, which I always appreciate students doing.
We, of course, remember where we were on September 11th, 2001. Your students were either not born or an infant at the time. So how do you teach post 9/11 politics and security issues to this generation?
It's really difficult, and particularly because I was teaching when it happened. So for a long time, I had students who had experienced it and had experienced it with me, and that was my recollection. And so now, I've seen kids who don't have any kind of living memory. I use video. I go to the archives, I go to news clips, and I show it, and then we talk through, okay, imagine what it would feel like to be watching this live, to not know. And I have some personal stories from my students of that day that I share with their consent that I think help contextualize it as well. But it's difficult because they don't remember meeting someone at the gate and that moment in a relationship where it was, do we love each other enough for me to pick you up at the airport and come to the gate, or am I going to just wait, on the curbside? They don't have any recollection of even those simple things. So contextualizing for them how the world has changed is definitely a challenge to help them place people's concerns about security, people's concerns about international threats in that divide of life before and after.
And part of that came with the president's first overseas trip. He traveled to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and talked about terrorism, national security, and immigration.
Every time a terrorist murders an innocent person and falsely invokes the name of God, it should be an insult to every person of faith. Terrorists do not worship God. They worship death. If we do not act against this organized terror, then we know what will happen and what will be the end result. Terrorism's devastation of life will continue to spread. Peaceful societies will become engulfed by violence, and the futures of many generations will be sadly squandered. If we do not stand in uniform condemnation of this killing, then not only will we be judged by our people, not only will we be judged by history, but we will be judged by God. This is not a battle between different faiths, different sects, or different civilizations. This is a battle between barbaric criminals who seek to obliterate human life and decent people, all in the name of religion.
So, Bill Kemps, as you hear the president outline his agenda in a post-9/11 world and really trying to turn the page from Barack Obama, how do you incorporate that into the classroom?
Certainly, we talk a lot about the world post 9/11 because that so many of the different themes that come up in history relating to what is America's appropriate role in the world, I think, have dramatically shifted in the post 9/11 world. So, in that regard, we talk about, what was the Obama doctrine, what was the Bush doctrine, what was their foreign policy approach, how did they see the world around them, how did they define terrorism, and then as we're seeing an emerging Trump doctrine, what does that look like? How can we be America first in his perspective, but at the same time he speaks a very hardline stance on the issue of terrorism. So how does he intend on balancing those two things and letting them just again explore what were some of the events that they've lived through as men who are that have shaped their perspective. For someone like living through Vietnam, that's going to have a very key impact on how they're going to want to do policy in combating terrorism.
And of course, this generation living through what's happening in North Korea. So if you want to call it the Trump doctrine, here is Secretary of State Rex Tillerson in New York at the United Nations earlier this year.
With each successive detonation and missile test, North Korea pushes Northeast Asia and the world closer to instability and broader conflict. The threat of a North Korean nuclear attack on Seoul or Tokyo is real, and it is likely only a matter of time before North Korea develops the capability to strike the U.S. mainland. Indeed, the DPRK has repeatedly claimed it plans to conduct such a strike. Given that rhetoric, the United States cannot idly stand by, nor can other members of this council who are within striking distance of North Korean missiles. Having for years displayed a pattern of behavior that defies multiple UN Security Council resolutions, including 2321 and 2270, and erodes global progress on nuclear nonproliferation, there's no reason to think that North Korea will change its behavior under the current multilateral sanctions framework. For too long, the international community has been reactive in addressing North Korea. Those days must come to an end. Failing to act now on the most pressing security issue in the world may bring catastrophic consequences. We have said this before, and it bears repeating. The policy of strategic patience is over. Additional patience will only mean acceptance of a nuclear North Korea.
So, Sunshine Cavalluzzi, as you look at that, how do you incorporate that to your government students? You have the issue of terrorism, you have the issue of national security, and you have the very real threat from North Korea.
Right. All of which are so deeply complicated and require, a really intense commitment to knowledge to delve into. And so I think if I actually loop all the way back to your first question about how do we teach government, how do we make history important right now, I think we start there. This is why we need to know what we've done before, so that we can understand how to respond to these situations when they present themselves now. I think also we talk about what are our responsibilities as voters, and one of them is to have a position on these issues, but to have not just a position, but an informed one. So we talk about understanding things like these are people who have access, people like Secretary of State Tillerson, to information we won't have for 30 years. And so we need to judge them remembering that they know more than we know, that the president and national security team knows more than we know, and they're acting in their best faith on the best information they have. But then as well exploring, if we act here, where else do we have to act? And that idea of a doctrine, what other commitments does that require? It's easy to see problems and want to help. I think that's our instinct as humans. And so for my students thinking about, as a voter, what does that mean? Where do you want to help? If we help here, where does that mean we also have to help? And then the last piece that I tend to talk about, I think for our students, their default is to assume all of our response has to be military, because that's what they see. That's what's in the movies, that's what's in video games, that's what's in a lot of, the news that they see. And so think about what else, what are our economic options, what are our political options, and so where is it our responsibility to go with those, and to get them to think through all that and approach it as voters is usually.
Well, let me pick up on that point. Different set of circumstances, but are there parallels to Vietnam in terms of how we have shaped American foreign policy, and could you hear part of that in Secretary of State Tillerson?
I think that there's certainly parallels in the fact that, just starting with the fact that Korea has not been a new story in American foreign politics, for more than a generation now. But yeah, certainly, again, I think there's this question of, well, we want to be aggressive. We want to make sure that the world knows that we're taking a stand on an issue, that we're not going to back down. We don't want to display weakness. But at the same time, how do you bring Americans into a conflict where there's no Pearl Harbor moment, there's no 9/11 moment, and so for a lot of times for Americans there's almost a defensiveness position of like, well, we'll react, but he's asking some sort of level of proaction, and that's a harder thing, I think, historically for Americans to show that they're willing to be in for the long conflict on, and so in that regard.
And as you know, every president at the start of a new administration with a new party in power tries to do something different from his predecessor. But is it different with this president?
I think it feels different. And I think, so that's a question for us to explore in the classroom. And again, having that context of history to go by. Does it feel different because it is different, or does it feel different because we see it? Does it feel different because he's directly communicating with us on Twitter in a way that no president ever has before? And so I think exploring those facets, it certainly feels...
On that, do students think that's a good or bad thing?
I think there's a mix. I think it's interesting because they have grown up always with anti-bullying doctrine and don't name call. And so seeing some of the stuff, and to them, they wouldn't talk like that. So it's a little like, what is happening right now? But I think they do like being able to hear this unfiltered thought, whether from a comedic perspective or from an information perspective. So I think there's fairly split opinion. I don't know in your class.
You're shaking your head.
I was just going to say, one of the talk about lessons for C-SPAN. One of the lessons of C-SPAN that I wrote last week was about is Twitter the new fireside chat? Is that really just this is the new medium? Where Roosevelt was able to say, he had a very friendly relationship with the press, but he was able to essentially say, I want to directly talk to the American people in their home, about the crisis going on, and is this just sort of the new waters that we're swimming in? So it's almost a question of like, it doesn't really matter if you like it or don't like it. Is this just your new reality? And if this is the new reality, what's the next president going to do? Like, where are we going from here? If this becomes the new normal, that presidents will use Twitter directly, then what is the next step? And even having them anticipate a little bit.
So react to Vice President Mike Pence speaking to a conservative gathering as he outlined the Trump-Pence agenda.
And since day one, this president has been taking decisive action to make this country great again. President Trump told you on Thursday, and I can tell you it's true, that he will, quote, in his words, battle for every American who's lost a job, every family who's lost a loved one, every American of faith who's lost their rights and lost their freedom. That's exactly what he's done. Our president's been busy since first day of this administration, rolling back big government, slashing through red tape. In fact, this president has signed more bills into law, rolling back federal regulations and red tape than any president in American history. He's unleashing American energy and unburdening American businesses. He's putting America back to work, and he's fighting every day to put America first, which was on full display just last week when President Donald Trump pulled the United States of America out of the Paris Climate Accord. It's amazing to think that international deal the last administration entered into would have cost 6.5 million jobs in this country in the next 25 years, imposed incredible burdens on the American people, while at the same time allowing countries like China and India to get off virtually scot-free. In his decision, the president put American workers first. He put America's future first. And I promise you that President Donald Trump will always put America first.
Vice President Mike Pence, and again, we're here with our two C-SPAN fellows, both high school teachers, Sunshine Capelluzzi, who teaches government, and Bill Camps, who teaches history. Let me go to your course on government and the fundamental question, what is the role of the federal government? Because you can use what you heard from Vice President Pence as a jumping off point about what should the government do and what should it steer clear of.
Absolutely. And I think that frames almost everything else we talk about. Certainly anything we talk about in the context of policy, and your position on it as a political activist comes back to what should the role of any government be, and in particular of the federal government. So those kinds of commentary are very effective and instructive in analyzing, do we agree with this and why or why not? But how do we fit that into our larger worldview, again, as citizens and as voters? But I think it also affords an opportunity to differentiate between politics and policy. So it's one thing to say you're going to do something. It's one thing to leak that you might be considering proposing a bill about fill in the blank, and for everybody to get up in arms and crazy about it and reactive, and this can't happen. And it's a whole different thing to actually have a bill go through its process. So it gives us a great venue to talk about what's the role, and then what does this look like when it actually gets done? And how does the end product look different than the beginning product? And where should we be freaking out if we're someone who doesn't think that that's a good idea?
Freaking out is an education term?
It is indeed.
Did you two know each other before you joined the program?
No.
No,
We did not
at all.
So you've become fast friends?
So yeah, and we found we work really well together. Yes. We've collaborated on a couple lessons, and it seems like we've got a good, Sunshine has her sort of definite wheelhouse of coming up with really creative and clever extension activities that are available for teachers to be able to say, okay, well we've laid out the lesson, we've asked some of the questions, we've put some video, but now here's where you can take this further. And I would say she is a master at that, I've noticed.
Thank you very much. And Bill is the king of incisive questions for kids to ask in Socratic seminars, in dialogues, and it's great.
So what's a good question to ask?
I would say, in regards to what your topic about the role of government, I would say, what would be allowing them to ask the question, where has that role of government changed over the course of the 20th century? How have Americans at different points, based on the things that they've lived through, how would they answer that question? How would somebody in the progressive era of 1910 answer that question versus somebody in the midst of the Great Depression versus somebody during the Carter administration on the eve of Reagan's administration? And so we can see that letting them understand, okay, somebody in these set of circumstances might have a very different opinion about the role of government than my circumstances here in 2017.
You're in New Jersey, you're in California. Have you compared notes on the students and any difference on each end of the coast, each end of the country, I should say?
And we do certainly have chatted about it and the differences in our schools and in our populations, but I think the answer to that question is the same as the answer to, are there differences between us and the founding fathers, that we ask all the time, that we've both done lessons about. And the answer is, kids are kids. They have different experiences that shape their worldview or shape their behaviors, but they are very, very similar. And I think this generation is extraordinary, and it is such a gift to spend time with them every day in Southern California, in New Jersey, and anywhere else in the country.
You've been teaching 17 years?
I have.
How long have you been teaching?
15.
And are your students watching, following the news any differently today than they were when you started?
Yes, very much so. And I think part of that is social media. I think the access to news has been much more egalitarian, I guess, in the sense that it's more accessible to them that way. But I think even, again, they're interested. I came away from that presidential election class, and those students, they were like, I have opinions, and I have ideas, and I want to do something with this. Where can I go? What can I do to be actually engaged? So it's great that we've raised awareness in the context of the events of the last year. But I think now our next step is, so what do we do with that? How do we take that energy that's so stored up and actually put it towards something that is productive?
And do you in any way deal with the political rhetoric versus the political reality?
I think absolutely, and that's one of our first challenges, or one of the first places that we go, particularly because kids are getting news differently, and most of them are getting it on their phone in a quick burst because they're scrolling through a feed on social media, and then they're deciding, do I click or do I not click? And so having them separate out, don't pause before you retweet, pause before you click, really think about, am I being manipulated in some way? Am I being marketed? Am I being targeted? Or is this really something that I care about? Or is my reaction emotional, or is it intellectual?
One of the most watched hearings ever for the C-SPAN networks, Jim Comey, the fired FBI director who testified on Capitol Hill on June the 8th. Again, it's on our video library if you want to use it in the classroom, cspan.org, and our website for teachers is cspan.org/classrooms. Here is Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat of Rhode Island.
The Russian investigation, as you have pointed out, and as all my colleagues have reflected, is one of the most serious hostile acts against this country in our history, undermining the very core of our democracy and our elections. It is not a discrete event. It will likely occur. It's probably being prepared now for 18 and 20 and beyond. And yet, the President of the United States fires you because, in your own words, some relation to this investigation. And then he shows up in the Oval Office with the Russian foreign minister, first after classifying you as crazy and a real nut job, which I think you've effectively disproved this morning. He said, I face great pressure because of Russia. That's taken off. Your conclusion would be that the President, I would think, is downplaying the seriousness of this threat. In fact, took specific steps to stop a thorough investigation of the Russian influence, and also, from what you've said or what was been said this morning, doesn't seem to be particularly interested in these hostile threats by the Russians. Is that fair?
I don't know that I can agree to that level of detail. There's no doubt that it's a fair judgment, it's my judgment, that I was fired because of the Russia investigation. I was fired in some way to change, or the endeavor was to change the way the Russia investigation was being conducted. That is a very big deal, and not just because it involves me. The nature of the FBI and the nature of its work requires that it not be the subject of political consideration. And then on top of that, you have the Russia investigation itself is vital because of the threat. And I know I should have said this earlier, but it's obvious. If any Americans were part of helping the Russians do that to us, that is a very big deal. And I'm confident that if that is the case, Director Mueller will find that evidence.
Bill Camps, how do you translate that moment in our history? And of course, earlier this year, as the FBI director testified before members of Congress, he's now writing a book, and turn that into a lesson plan?
Well, that is an example where how I taught something last year changed this year in light of the events. So this actually came out right around the time we were just wrapping up the Nixon-Watergate discussion. And so certainly there was a lot of media outlets that were saying, is this, is the firing of Comey similar to the sort of Saturday Night Massacre? And so students were like, well, what's the Saturday Night Massacre? Like, this became an opportunity where vocabulary that I may have in previous years moved past quickly for the sake of curriculum and other events that were going on at the time. I was like, no, this is a word. You're hearing this. This is a hashtag. This is something that we need to make sure that you're clarifying, and to really say, okay, so here's this event playing out. Here's the firing of the FBI director. How similar is this to Archibald Cox? How different is it? Is this comparable to a Watergate Saturday Night Massacre occurrence? Does this going to have the same direction? And so, because the media outlets were engaging in that question. The media outlets were discussing it. You'd have people on both political sides asking, no, this is totally different situation. Others were saying, this is exactly like that, and letting the students kind of really sift through those opinions and say, well, what's actually the accurate statement?
Sunshine Cavaluzzi, as this was playing out, what were your students telling you?
One of the things they were really hung up on, I think, was how Director Comey found out. Right, that he was giving the speech, that he was on the other side of the country, and then he thought it was a joke at first, and their first reaction was very much about that. It was that empathy to his situation rather than to the fact that he'd lost his job, which I thought was interesting, and also a reflection on who they are as students. But for us, it lent itself so beautifully to a discussion we have all year long, which is what's the difference between can and should. And that plays out when we talk about free speech. It plays out when we talk about freedom of religion. It plays out all the time when we talk about the role of government and the powers of government. So could the president do this? Of course he could, which Director Comey acknowledged himself in the letter, and it was great that got released so we could read it. But should you do these things? And that difference, again, between politics and policy, between what's allowed and what's expected, it really lent itself to some wonderful questions. And of course, on the West Coast, we're 3 hours behind, which usually is fairly inconvenient for us in terms of breaking news. But in this case, my AP government class was at the beginning of the day. So it was ideal for us in terms of timing, because the hearing, was, again, you throw out your lesson plan and you say, okay, last year on this day, I might have talked about something else, but today we're queuing up C-SPAN and let's watch the hearing.
Let's talk about the third branch of government, the U.S. Supreme Court, and we saw that play out last year as the Republicans blocked the nomination of President Obama, Merrick Garland, to serve on the court with the passing of Antonin Scalia, and then this year with the nomination of Neil Gorsuch, who now sits on the U.S. Supreme Court as an Associate Justice.
So it was fascinating to look at again and making relevant. We talk about Senate confirmation hearings, and that's not something that is as, let's say, appealing to students as whether or not the Fourth Amendment means if someone's having a party and the police come, they can come inside. Senate confirmation hearings are a little tougher to sell, but that made it highly relevant to their lives. And so as much as it was unprecedented to watch and raised questions, it certainly was a gift to a government teacher to say, here's why we have to care about the rules and the leadership and who controls these things and what they do and the different implications.
Well, here's one of those moments from the Senate floor and the Senate Republican leader, Mitch McConnell of Kentucky.
When President Clinton nominated Stephen Breyer, I voted to confirm him. When President Clinton nominated Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I voted to confirm her. I thought it was the right thing to do. After all, he won the election. He was the president. The president gets to appoint Supreme Court justices. When President Obama nominated Sonia Sotomayor and Elena Kagan, I led my party in working to ensure that they received an up or down vote, not a filibuster. We were in exactly the same position that our Democratic friends are today. No filibuster. No filibuster. We thought it was the right thing to do. It's not because we harbored illusions that we'd usually agree with these nominees of Democratic presidents, certainly not. Listen to this, Madam President. We even protested when then Majority Leader Reid tried to file cloture on the Kagan nomination. We talked him out of it, said it wasn't necessary. And Jeff Sessions, the current Attorney General, was the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee at the time. Jeff Sessions talking Harry Reid out of filing cloture because it wasn't necessary. We didn't even want the pretense of the possibility of a filibuster on the table. Well, it's quite a different story from what we're seeing today. But this is where our Democratic colleagues have taken us. Will a partisan minority of the Senate really prevent the Senate's pro-Gorsuch bipartisan majority from confirming him? Will they really subject this eminently qualified nominee to the first successful partisan filibuster in American history? Americans will be watching. History will be watching. And the future of the Senate will hang on their choice.
From the Senate floor, of course, Bill Camp's Neil Gorsuch did finally get confirmed. Mm-hmm. He did not mention, though, what happened last year.
No. I mean, he didn't get into all the situation with Merrick Garland's nomination being held off for what was certainly almost a year in terms of trying to essentially prevent Obama from filling that seat that was left by Scalia, and that was certainly one of those events that I probably didn't overstate enough. I probably, in that sense, that of trying to understand what they were living through was certainly a historic event to see the length of time for that seat to remain vacant during the last year of a presidency. And for the students, it really was a good moment to let them understand just how partisan things have become, that this was something that's a sort of a process in our history, was really stalled out in the name of partisanship.
Which may set a precedent, because if the Republicans lose control of the Senate, and hypothetically, if Donald Trump has a nomination in 2020 with Democrats controlling the Senate, again, hypothetical, you wonder if there'd be political payback.
Absolutely, and you can't imagine that there won't be. So that was another one of the lessons that I did, was on the change in the nuclear option, and that, you could argue that what Mitch McConnell did is payback to Harry Reid, lowering the cloture margin for other federal nominations, and all of the political calculus in it. And I thought it was interesting as it was happening, saying to kids, Mitch McConnell's gambling on a Republican winning the presidency, which at that time wasn't certainly as foreseen as it turns out. Mitch McConnell was more prescient than maybe we should give him credit for at the time. But I can't imagine there won't be retaliation, because this has been going on for so long with judges, and we're just seeing it continue to escalate.
For both of you, do you have a sense, this is a broader question, that Washington matters to these students? They're following it, but do you have a sense that it matters?
I think that's a hard statement to generalize with students. I mean, I certainly think that for some, they are all in, and they are political junkies, and they will follow the events and they'll follow the stories. I think for some, we have students who are worrying about what are they going to eat that day, and so they can't. It's almost like they don't have the privilege of seeing if Washington matters, and not that it shouldn't. I mean, there's absolutely direct connections. I mean, on some of the topics of immigration, that hits very home for many of my students. I have a very, very ethnically diverse school that I teach at, and so there's moments where there's an overlap, but a lot of times I think students can come in with just a different set of things that they're really thinking about in the course of their day. Thinking about maybe their parents, thinking about their parents' jobs, thinking about the responsibilities they have to pick up some of the economic slack. And so in that regard, there's often that disconnect that we try our best, I think, to make that connection for them, but it's just hard when life's realities come into play.
And for your students in Placentia, California?
I think that's our job, is to explain to them why it does matter. If they don't understand, why are these realities that you're facing? Can you afford to go to college? Should you take out a student loan in order to do it? Can you get a part-time job to help your family make expenses? All of that's connected to what happens here, but it feels remote. When you see it on TV, when you don't feel like maybe Congress looks like you, or you don't feel like you understand, you don't realize how important not only the decisions that are made here, but your voice is in influencing those decisions. And that's my cell every day, every period, in my class. This is why you need to care. I don't think a lot of students understand why they should, and I think that's absolutely my greatest responsibility, is to teach them that not only should they understand, but they need to act. They have to add their voice to the narrative in order to get a government that reflects their interests, which is exactly the government that they deserve.
And I ask that because the healthcare debate is something that affects all Americans one way or the other. So here is the independent senator from Vermont. He ran for the Democratic nomination in 2016, Senator Bernie Sanders.
Mr. President, I know that no Republican wants to see anybody die. None of us do. But that is the reality that we are dealing with, and you cannot ignore it. If somebody has cancer, if somebody has heart disease, and you take away their health insurance, I don't need studies from Harvard University to tell me and to tell you what you know to be the case. This is the United States of America, and we can do better than that. Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent that the article that appeared today in the Annals of Internal Medicine be submitted to the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, this issue is really not just about health care. This is a profound moral debate defining who we are as a people today and who we want to be as a people in the future. Mr. President, a great nation is not simply one judged by how many millionaires and billionaires we have and by how many tax breaks we can give to billionaires. A great nation is judged by how we treat the weakest and the most vulnerable amongst us. Those people who don't have fundraising dinners, those people who don't contribute hundreds of thousands of dollars into the political process. A great nation is judged by how we treat the children, the elderly, the sick, the poor, the people who have disabilities. That's what a great nation is. This legislation is not worthy of a great nation. This legislation must be defeated. I yield the floor.
From the Senate floor, and again, one voice out of many in the one topic that has really consumed Washington and the country, health care in America. How does that play out in the classroom?
Well, it plays out in the classroom and all day long. In fact, when the day that the House voted on the bill, I was home that night watching the news and my email pinged, and it was one of my students saying, "But my brother's diabetic. This is going to change his life. What do I do? I should have been paying more attention. What do I do?" And so I think for people, this issue is, as you mentioned, it's so real, it's so resonant. And so in the classroom, we have to talk about, what do you do? What are your responsibilities? And it starts with making your voice heard. And don't let anyone tell you it doesn't matter. Don't get cynical. In here, it's all the lobbyists, it's all the special interests. A special interest can't vote. You can. A special interest is an amorphous idea that can't walk into a congressman's town hall meeting, but you can. And so you have to, and you have to be informed. So that's how it plays out for me, like every other issue. And this one more so, it's more compelling, but it's that platform for you need to have an opinion and you need to take action, whatever that opinion might be. If you support this, if you don't, you need to let your voice be heard.
What is your student population in Southern California?
Sure, and in the high school where I teach, we have about 20% of our students are on free and reduced lunch. We also have a significant number of students with college-educated parents who are upper middle class. We're about 50% white, about 30% Hispanic in some form, and the remaining Asian and African American. So it's a fairly mixed group.
And so your daughter will be in high school this fall, correct?
She'll be in middle school, so she's coming to my school 2 falls from now, which is going to be an amazing thing.
And what about your student population?
We have about 1,500 students. We are really, truly a sort of a center of the the nations, in a sense. There's just students who speak multiple languages of all different backgrounds who come into the school. We always say that, they talk about the trends of the United States demographics, and we kind of tell our Heightstown students, like, you're already here. Like, you are what the country is going to be looking like in just a few years. So in that sense, just seeing the trends of again, different, and that's not just ethnic diversity, it includes economic diversity.
So how do you approach your classroom engagement and structure with students, so many coming from outside the U.S.?
Sure, and that is a real challenge. And I actually appreciate our school has really taken steps in the last couple of years to really push that we as teachers need to be very cognizant of English language learners. The school is looking at ways to get more teachers certified in ESL because that is a very real reality, and that's not just for our Spanish-speaking students. We have students who are, again, coming from a lot of different walks of life, and we need to be, as teachers, understand that we may not be able to teach the same way we taught even 10 years ago, that the world is changing and our students' needs are changing, and we need to be willing to adapt. And it can definitely be a challenge, and I'm certainly not near with the expert level on that where I should be, but it's a challenge that is important if you want to do this well.
One of the longest single events in terms of a town hall we covered in your area, Congressman Tom MacArthur, he's a Republican from New Jersey. He held a 5-hour-plus town hall meeting. And so this is a moment where politics and policy and civic engagement comes together. Let's watch and get your reaction.
Now, my friends and I came here because we feel the need, and not because we're having fun. We're not children. We are seriously concerned with ourselves and everyone else around us. We are the future, and we are going to vote. And I am going to vote in 2018, and so are we all. Now, I'd like to go back to a question that my friend Joey asked you, which you neglected to answer. Is rape considered a pre-existing condition under your amendment? Yes or no? Yes or no? Yes or no? One word, please. One word, please.
Folks, you get to ask the questions, and I get to answer them.
Yes, so answer them. So answer them.
I'll answer when people start.
Now, let me say one more thing. Someone correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not trying to spread false information. I believe the statistic is 1 in 5 women will be the victim of a completed or attempted rape before their freshman year in college. I can't even fathom that. And the fact that that may be considered a pre-existing condition, and you call that not discriminating against women? What do you say about that? Thank you. How can you say that and still not answer to me whether rape is a pre-existing condition or not?
Here's why I won't answer it the way you want.
No, just answer it.
I will answer, but...
Okay. My friends and I plan to continue getting involved. You will answer to us. You are our representative. We are voting against you. You will answer to us.
I'll answer the question if you let me.
I have given you multiple pauses. Nothing.
It's possible that there is somebody who has been subject to rape in this room. It's possible. I will not reduce that to calling it a pre-existing condition.
But your bill will.
No, my bill does not do that. My amendment doesn't do that.
So you're saying that rape is not a pre-existing condition?
What I've said before, if you listen to what I said, is you cannot be denied or charged more because of having been raped.
Right, that's not my question.
Bill Camps, that's a high school student engaged with Congressman MacArthur of New Jersey. Again, a 5-hour-plus town hall meeting that I guess you wanted to attend.
Yeah, he's my congressman. So I was actually hoping to get there that night, but I had some family obligations that didn't allow me to get there.
But as you watch that, what's your takeaway?
I think that student is students that I encounter, students I know who have attended rallies and gone to political events this year, students who again will come in and just like they have either anger or frustration, they have questions, and they're looking for an outlet. And I think for many of them, they realize that you know what, I have a voice, I have an opportunity to get involved. As Sunshine kind of said before, that like I can't just be the person to complain about this on the internet and not step in and do something. I have a great group that I taught this year into my humanities class, and they were just wonderful. And I have students that I know will go on to go into, like, one of them wants to be a civil rights attorney now because of some of the discussions that came out this year. And just they have the drive, they have the desire. They just need the resources, the materials, and the right direction to go and be engaged. And it's awesome actually to watch in that sense.
Two final points. First, what was your path to becoming a high school teacher?
Sure, I actually teach at the high school that I attended. So for me, I went to UC San Diego. I double majored in political science and U.S. history. I've always loved the social sciences. And I thought I eventually wanted to teach, but I wanted to do something before. And I worked in a little bit in some consulting realms, but it never left me what an impact my high school teachers made on me. They challenged me, they saw me, they nurtured me. They really made me see that I was capable of more than I knew. So for me, it was the chance to give that back, but to pay it forward, which is exactly what my teachers would have wanted me to do. It's the ability to hopefully play that role for someone else. But our students have amazing stories. The kids at the town halls, the kids that are creating change are incredible. And the fact that we get to be this teeny tiny footnote in those stories is such an extraordinary, extraordinary gift. And I wouldn't do anything else with my life.
And for you?
It's funny, I had a guidance counselor in high school who, and I never had a particularly close relationship with her, but every time we would meet for anything college related, she goes, you know, you'd make a great teacher. And I'd be like, I don't know what that, sure, okay, you know, and I never really gave it much attention, but somehow that I appreciate that there were teachers in my life along the way who were able to see something in me that I had the gift for this. That it's not something that everybody can interact with high schoolers and commit to them and be wanting to bring out the best in them. And for somebody saw that in me. And so I think I'm simply trying to do that with my students, is to try to speak the things that are important that maybe somebody else isn't saying to them, not just about their place in history, but who they are as individuals, and say, yes, you have something, you have what it takes, you have the ability to be successful at something, and to speak that into their life, because sometimes there's nobody else who is doing it. And that's a great, great privilege we have as teachers, is to be able to be the people on top of that and be the people that can push them in that direction.
So let me conclude with this point. What have you learned this summer? What are your plans when you start back to school in August or September? And how do you plan to incorporate what we do here into the classroom?
Sure. I've learned every day from delving further into C-SPAN clips. I've used C-SPAN resources before in my classroom, but the chance to come in and really see even more, the wealth of things that are available. One of the things that I've loved is every time I've thought, it'd be fun to do a lesson on fill in the blank, C-SPAN's got a clip for that. Or you far predate thee, there's an app for that. Right? There's a C-SPAN for that. So that's been really extraordinary. I've learned a lot watching the way people interact here, the philosophy of C-SPAN. That's been a teachable moment for me that I can then translate into my classroom. And going back, I'll certainly use the stuff that I've created. I'm definitely going to use the stuff that Bill's created as well, because it's great. And I look forward next week at our teacher conferences to interacting with even more educators and learning from them about the things that they're doing.
Yeah, I would say, selfishly, I think a lot of the lessons that I created were things that I was like, I know I would use this. Mm-hmm. So I'm gonna, if I'm here and I'm being encouraged to develop lessons that people would use, I know that a lot of them are things that I have full intention of trying to incorporate. And I do appreciate having just the chance to sit and really take in the materials that C-SPAN has to offer. I think it's been really helpful to know that there really is just a wide array of ways we can use this material. And then the other thing that I'm hoping to kick up in the fall is another new elective called the Active Citizen, that would allow students a chance to kind of go and get involved in their community and do very service-oriented stuff. So I will certainly be sharing my experience here and sharing just some of the different stories and the people I've met along the way this past these 4 weeks when it's all said and done. That there's a lot of different ways you can be involved and engaged, and it doesn't always have to be running for Congress. But there's a whole wide group of people who are finding their ways to make a difference and being engaged citizens, and to let them know that there are those options.
Bill Kemps, a high school history teacher from Hightstown, New Jersey, and Sunshine Cavalluzzi, who teaches in Placentia, California, government and politics. To both of you, thank you very much for being with us. A reminder, you can check out all of our information, cspan.org/classroom.